Okay? All right. Wait till I start to make a point. Yep. Let's go to Acts. Acts chapter 12. Take a break from Romans, seeing we're in the Easter season, and talk a little bit about some of the controversy. I know this lesson's really long, or at least it appears to be long, but we're going to stick pretty well to the notes because at least this week, and look at this week and next week. And so I titled this, Let's Not Passover Easter, because there's a controversy regarding the use of the word Easter in the King James Bible and what that means. So let's go ahead and pray, and we'll get into our text. Father, thank you for this day that you've given to us and this time to gather together to study your word. And Lord, I pray that you bless our time, give us wisdom, help us to be faithful students of your word, and I pray that you just be honored and glorified in our attitudes and our actions this day. In Jesus' name, amen. So let's, Acts chapter 12, and let's look here at these first 4 verses. Now about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church. And he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Now, this is a key phrase here. Then were the days of unleavened bread. And we're going to get into that more next week, but this is a very important phrase, and we're going to talk about it a little bit this week. But just keep that in mind. Verse 4, and when he had apprehended him, talking about Peter, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. So, Easter appears in our Bible one time. Why? Why does it show up in our Bible? And we're going to go through this and look at this. This is probably going to be the only time that I deal with it this in depth. I got putting this together yesterday. I was like, this is way more than I was wanting to do, but here it is. So let's just go ahead and get started right into this here. There is a debate today on whether Easter is an accurate translation of the Greek word Pascha, or it may even be pronounced Pascha. I think Pascha is the correct pronunciation in Acts 12:4 in the King James Bible. Critics of the King James Bible, or those that would oppose the King James Bible and say that we need to use the modern versions, have sought to use Acts 12:4 as a case in point to prove that the King James Bible is not inerrant. So we would say that the King James Bible, or at least I would hope you would say this, King James Bible doesn't have any errors in it. That there's no mistranslations. And that's certainly where we would stand. Those on the other side would say, well, you see, the King James Bible is full of errors. There's all these mistranslations and stuff like that. And then they'll point to this right here and say, well, see, it uses the word Easter. And Easter is obviously a mistranslation. And we'll see why they say that. We'll get into that argument. But they allege that Easter is a mistranslation of the Greek word Pascha and thus constitutes an error. Many defenders of the inerrancy of the King James Bible have sought to answer these critics and have put forth arguments, some bad, for why Easter is not a mistake in this passage. So this is the controversy that's going on. On our side, we would say Easter is not a mistranslation. On the other side, they would say Easter is a mistranslation. And those on our side who would defend the King James Bible, they bring up different arguments to show why it is not a mistranslation, why it is fine for it to say Easter. In fact, some would go farther, and they would propose arguments that, well, there's this special thing going on and all these different things, and with Herod to say, well, you see, they're using that word there to show that that's what it's talking about. But the problem is it's the Greek word. Okay, so let's look here at this controversy. So this is where we get into looking at both sides of this. And then next week we'll get more into solving why it's this way in particular. So the Greek word Pascha occurs 29 times in 27 verses in the Greek Textus Receptus. That's the Greek text that underlies our New Testament. The New Testament was written in Greek. Of these 29 occurrences in the New Testament, the translators rendered it Passover 28 times, which means how many times are left? One. And it's right here that it was translated as something else. In this one spot, they translated the same word that they translated Passover 28 times. They translated here Easter. Why? I mean, it's kind of like you're going along and then all of a sudden somebody just throws a monkey wrench into it. This is the monkey wrench right here. Why? Why is that there? So let's look at what the critics say. And this is just going to be one example. I'm just going to give one example on both sides of this and kind of break some of these things apart to help understand what's going on. So it is assumed that there should be identical wording is one of the things that's going on here. And when I say identical wording, you could take a Greek or a Hebrew word and you can have different English words that mean the exact same thing. For instance, you could take the Greek word for warning and you can translate it as warning, or you can translate it as admonish, or you can translate it as warn, or you can even translate it as to rebuke. And so it's practically the exact same meaning, it's just using different words. Well, critics of the King James Bible don't like it that the King James translators do that, and they want the same Greek word or the same Hebrew word to be translated the exact same every single time. And it just would read really funny if we did that sometimes. And so the critics theorize that Pascha should always be translated Passover. They also assume, now this is an assumption, and we're going to break this down, but this is an assumption that the word Easter has pagan origins and therefore is a mistranslation of the Greek word. So they'll look at this and say, well, see, it says Easter, but the Greek word is for Passover, and so why are they taking a pagan holiday and inserting it into the Jewish Passover? That's the argument that they make on their side. And so let's look at this here. This and other arguments have led to many viewing the King James Bible as an error. For example, and this is from James White. He's a critic of the King James Bible. He debates King James people all the time, and he would say that he's a lover of the King James Bible. He's not. And this is what he says in his book, The King James Only Controversy. One might include the King James Version's universal rendering of Acts 12:4 as more of a mistranslation than an ambiguous reading. And it would be hard to argue against this assertion given the facts. So this is what he says. The word that the KJV translates as Easter occurs 29 times in the Greek in the New Testament. In each of the other 28 instances, the KJV translates the phrase as the Passover. For example, John 19:14, and it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he saith unto Jesus, unto the Jews, behold your king. So there's an example where Pascha is translated the Passover. Okay? And there's no reason for confusion as to what Luke, referring back to Acts chapter 12, is referring to here. For the preceding verse says, then were the days of unleavened bread. The days of unleavened bread, of course, were connected with the Passover celebration. Yet in this one place, the AV contains the anachronistic term Easter. So anachronistic means that I'm taking a word that's more modern, a term that's more modern, and I'm applying it to a time before that term ever existed. So for instance, if I were to look at, say, Augustine's writings and say Augustine was a Calvinist, well, Augustine was writing in the 200s AD. Well, John Calvin didn't come along until the 1500s. So while the theology is the same, it would be anachronistic to apply Calvinism to Augustine, because the term hadn't been invented yet at that point in history. So that's the idea here. So what White is saying is that the term Easter did not come along for several hundred years later, so why would we be confusing Easter by putting it into the King James Bible as though they were referring to this pagan holiday that came along later in time? I hope that makes sense, because I don't know that I could repeat it again. So Luke's reference to the days of unleavened bread make it clear that he is referring to the Jewish holiday season, not, and here's where the confusion is, not to some pagan festival that did not become known by that specific term for some time to come. So that's the argument that he's making. Now, he is right on one thing. It is, and we'll look at this more next week, we'll look at it a little bit today, but more next week, it is a term for the Passover. Okay, that the Greek word is Passover. The word Easter, and I'll show you this next week, more references to it than you would care to have ever in your life, that Easter is the right translation, and it is a reference to the Passover. In fact, if you look at earlier English translations of the Bible prior to the King James Version, everywhere where we see Passover in the New Testament, they translate it as Easter. Oh, that's kind of interesting. Well, why would they do that? Because that's what Easter meant back then. And it's interesting, too, if this is a facsimile King James Bible, and so it has all the stuff in the beginning that it had in 1611. And if Easter was a reference to a pagan holiday, then why do they have it in here, a calendar on how to find Easter forever? That's what it's called. Why would they want that? It's because they understand that it has reference to the Jewish Passover and not to a pagan holiday. That actually came later, that connection, which I'll show you in just a moment. But he is wrong that it's a mistranslation, so it's not a mistranslation. There are a couple of problems here. One, he assumes that Easter is referring to a pagan holiday. That's the first assumption that he gets wrong. Secondly, that the Greek word Pascha never meant Easter in English, but rather it always meant Passover. And so, and I just mentioned that, Easter prior to 1611 was always a reference to Passover. That's how the English-speaking people understood it. That's how the Germans understood it. Europeans understood it that way. So let's go on. Now, the defenders of the King James Bible. And this is one of the arguments that they put forth, and it's a really bad argument. It's a really bad argument. It makes the exact same assumptions and tries to force them upon the text. Now, this is the key argument that you will hear. Probably everyone in this room has heard this same argument. I used to believe this very thing until I got studying one day, and I saw what Easter meant and where it came from, and I was like, well, that's really interesting. That kind of messes me up on some things. But so let's look at this. Believers in the inerrancy of the King James Bible, which would be us, have sought to defend this rendering of Pascha in Acts 12:4 and rescue it from criticism. The classic example of this is Sam Gipp's 1989 book, The Answer Book. Not necessarily a bad book, but there's just some things. Tell you the truth, I don't like Sam Gipp, not the slightest bit. I would not go across town to hear him at a church. We'll get in that another time, personally, if you want more information on that. But this is what he says in his book. So his book is set up as it's an answer book, so it's set up as a series of question and answers. And so the question that he proposes, isn't Easter in Acts 12:4 a mistranslation of the word Pascha, and should it be translated as Passover? And so this is his answer. No. Pascha is properly translated Easter in Acts 12:4, as the following explanation will show. So he is right that Easter is a proper translation. What he is wrong on is pretty much everything that he says after this. And this is what he says. And so this is the assumption that he's going to make, that Easter is an ancient pagan holiday connected with the worship of the goddess Astarte and Ishtar. So here's what he says. Coming to the word Easter in God's authorized Bible, they seize upon it, imagining they have found proof that the Bible is not perfect. Fortunately for lovers of the words of God, they are wrong. Easter, as we know it, comes from the ancient pagan festival of Astarte, also known as Ishtar. Now watch this. I have it underlined there. Ishtar, pronounced Easter. That's not accurate. That is not accurate. This is an argument that comes from a fellow by the name of Alexander Hislop in the 1800s. Prior to that, no one made this connection. And his argument was, well, Easter sounds like Ishtar, so they must have the same origin and must come from one another. I'll show you that in a moment. This festival has always been held late in the month of April. Again, that is an error. Sorry. But it was, in its original form, a celebration of the earth regenerating itself after the winter season. The festival involved a celebration of reproduction. For this reason, the common symbols of Easter festivities were the rabbit, the symbol, supposed to be the symbol of Playboy magazine, and the egg. So, now, Easter does not have pagan origins. However, many of the things that are associated with Easter in our culture do have pagan origins. That's why you go to the store at this time and they're not filled up with crosses and various things like that, or lamb things. It's all bunnies and eggs and all sorts of weird things. That's because they have brought in these things later, but that's not what it had always been. Both are known for their reproductive abilities. At the center of attention was Astarte, the female deity. She is known in the Bible as the Queen of Heaven. She is the mother of Tammuz, who was also her husband. These perverted rituals would take place at sunrise on Easter morning. From the reference to Jeremiah and Ezekiel, we can see that the true Easter has never had any association with Jesus Christ. So that's his assumption. And he goes on. The problem, even though the Jewish Passover was held in mid-April, which is not true. It would have been held toward the end of our March and beginning of April, because the month Abib, when it was celebrated, corresponds to our mid-March and mid-April. The way our calendars overlap in that way. Where are we at? There we are. And the pagan festival Easter was held later the same month. How do we know that Herod was referring to Easter in Acts 12:4 and not the Jewish Passover? Now, this is what he says. If he was referring to the Passover, the translation of Pascha as Easter is incorrect. If he was indeed referring to the pagan holy day or holiday, Easter, then the King James Bible, 1611, must truly be the very word and words of God, for it is the only Bible in print today which is correct, which is the correct reading. So he's making the assumption that in Acts 12:4, Herod is anticipating celebrating a pagan festival later on after the Jewish Passover. And so that's the assumption that Gipp is making. And so here's another assumption. And we're going to look at a couple of these verses here. So let's go over to Exodus chapter 12. Exodus chapter 12. So these three verses are these are the primary Passover passages. Next week we're going to look at some more, but this is what Gipp offers, is these passages, and if these were the only passages, I would say he's right. But these are not the only passages on the issue. So these are the passages that he offers. Now, watch how this is worded here. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 13. It says, "And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where ye are." So this is when God's instituting the Passover. He's giving Moses the instruction for killing the lamb and the death angel coming and put the blood on the doorposts and he'll pass over. And he says, "And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt." Now, right there where he says, "I will pass over you," this is where the concept of Passover comes from. This is the first time this concept appears in the Bible. And so that carries over throughout the Bible. Actually, it was Tyndale that came up with the term Passover. That was an entirely new English word. And where he got that from is when he was translating this portion of Passover being two words, when he came to it farther on in the Old Testament, the only thing that he could do was just make reference back to this to say Passover. And so that's where that came from. But then when he got to the New Testament, so in the Old Testament it's Passover, in the New Testament he translated it as Easter, which I thought was interesting. So he says, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. And this day shall be unto you for a memorial, and ye shall keep it a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. Ye shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. Now watch this. 7 days shall ye eat unleavened bread. Even the first day ye shall put away leaven out of your houses. For whosoever eateth leavened bread from the first day until the seventh day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. And in the first day there shall be an holy convocation. That means a day of rest. So there would be a special Sabbath that takes place there. We'll talk more about that in a couple weeks. And in the seventh day there shall be an holy convocation. So again, so there would be the Passover. Then the first day of unleavened bread would be a day of rest. It would be a Sabbath. Then you would go through 6 more days. On that last day, that seventh day, would be another holy Sabbath. To you, no manner of work shall be done in it, save that which every man must eat, that only may be done of you. And ye shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever. Is that the last of that verse? Verse 18. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at even, ye shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at even. So you'd have the 14th day of the month would be the Passover, and then the 15th to the 21st is the days of unleavened bread. And so what Gipp is arguing is that these two events, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, are never, that's the assumption that he makes, they are never connected. Now, that doesn't jive with the New Testament, because the New Testament, just spoiler alert for next week, the New Testament puts them together almost every time as being the exact same event. It refers to the Feast of Unleavened Bread as the Passover, and it refers to the Passover as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So, but we'll look at that next week. Let's go to Numbers. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Numbers 28. Numbers 28, verse 16. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, chapter 28, verse 16. Lord is again giving them instruction regarding the Passover. Verse 16, and in the 14th day of the first month is the Passover of the Lord. And in the 15th day of this month is the feast. 7 days shall unleavened bread be eaten. In the first day shall be an holy convocation. Ye shall do no manner of servile work therein, but ye shall offer a sacrifice made by fire for a burnt offering unto the Lord, 2 young bullocks. And then he goes on down to describe that. So, again, we see the Passover on the 14th. Then on the 15th begins the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then let's look at Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 16. Am I talking too fast? Okay. Okay. Just making sure. I feel like I'm talking too fast. My patience, I don't have a very long attention span. And so when I listen to things, especially when they're hard for me to listen to, like if I'm listening to a lecture on YouTube or listening to a preacher on YouTube or something like that, and I'm having a hard time keeping my attention on it, I'll do it at 1.5 times speed or twice the speed. So it's really fast, and that keeps me engaged, and that gets stuck in my head, that speed sometimes. So, and then Deuteronomy 16, notice here verses 1 through 8. At the end of every 7 years, that's 15, 16, verse 1, observe the month of Abib, which is the first month of the year for the Jews, and keep the Passover unto the Lord thy God. For in the month of Abib the Lord thy God brought thee forth out of Egypt by night. Thou shalt therefore sacrifice the Passover unto the Lord thy God of the flock of the land, of the herd, in the place which the Lord shall choose to place his name there. Thou shalt eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days shalt thou eat unleavened bread therewith, even the bread of the affliction, for thou camest forth out of the land of Egypt in haste, that thou mayest remember the day when thou camest forth out of the land of Egypt all the days of thy life. And there shall be no leavened bread seen with thee in all thy coast 7 days. Neither shall there anything of the flesh which thou sacrificest the first day at even remain until all night until the morning. Thou mayest not sacrifice the Passover within any of thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, but at the place which the Lord thy God shall choose to place his name there. So basically what he's saying there, you're going to have all these different cities that I'm going to give you when you go into the promised land. You're not allowed to do the sacrifice of the Passover in those cities. You have to come to the place where the tabernacle is, and that's where you can do the sacrifice of the Passover. At the going down of the sun, at the even, at that season that thou comest forth out of Egypt. Thou shalt roast and eat it in the place which the Lord thy God shall choose, and thou shalt turn in the morning and go unto thy tents. 6 days shalt thou eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day shall be a solemn assembly to the Lord thy God. Thou shalt do no work therein. So Gipp takes these three passages and he says, see, the 7-day feast of unleavened bread is never associated with the Passover. And if this was all that there was, he would be right. But now notice what he says here in his response. On the 14th of April, again, it's not April, the lamb was killed. This is the Passover. No event following the 14th is ever referred to as the Passover. So again, next page here, the assumption is that the days of unleavened bread began on the 15th of the month, the day after Passover, which that is true, but this is the assumption: the days of unleavened bread are always after Passover and never referred to as Passover. So when I was in school, they tried to teach us, you never say never, and you always refrain from saying always. I guess that's a pretty good rule, because usually when somebody says never or always, it's an exaggeration. It's not exactly true, and that's the case here. So this is what he says. Whenever the Passover was kept, it always preceded the Feast of Unleavened Bread. On the morning of the 15th begins the days of unleavened bread, also known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It must also be noted that whenever the Passover is mentioned in the New Testament, and this is all wrong, the reference is always to the meal to be eaten on the night of April 14th, not the entire week. The days of unleavened bread are never referred to as the Passover. It must be remembered that the angel of the Lord passed over on one night, not 7 nights in a row. Another assumption: Peter was arrested during the days of unleavened bread, which is after the Passover. Verse 3. So this would be going back to Acts chapter 12. Let's head back over there. Now, while you're headed back over there, I just want to go ahead and read for you one verse out of Luke's Gospel. And I'm just going to give you one verse here, just so you don't think, yeah, you keep saying that, but you need to back it up. So it's Luke 22, verse 1, and I'll show you more verses next week, because this isn't just New Testament, it's also in the Old Testament. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover. So right there, Luke makes mention of the fact the Feast of Unleavened Bread is called the Passover. So I mean, that throws a monkey wrench into everything that he's saying. So, just pointing that out. So, verse 3 here, again, it says, "And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread." So, verse 3, he says, shows that Peter was arrested during the days of unleavened bread. The Bible says, then were the days of unleavened bread. The Passover had already come and gone. Now, from Luke chapter 22, is that true? No, it's still the Passover. It's still a Passover. Here's the next one. This is the assumption, Herod was a pagan who worshipped Ishtar and had no reason to keep the Passover. Now, Herod was a pagan. Herod was not a Jew, and this infuriated the Jews. What Herod is doing here in Acts chapter 12 is all political. It is all political. Herod is an Idumean. He's an Edomite. He is not a rightful heir to sit on the throne in Jerusalem. And so the Jews despise Herod. It was Rome that put Herod on the throne. They didn't give the Jews the chance to choose this king. And so the Jews hate him. Any decision he makes, the Jews hate him. And so when he kills James, the brother, with the sword, and the Jews get excited about that because he was a leader in the church, Jews got excited about that. He's like, oh, well, this is my way to get some inroads in and get some brownie points with the Jewish people. So he's going to do it with Peter also. But if he killed Peter during the feast, that's not going to make the Jews very happy. Because this is one of the reasons they had to take Jesus down off the cross and get the thieves off the cross prior to the Passover celebration taking place, is because Jerusalem had to be cleansed. You remember Judas had hung himself. Well, Judas actually hung himself on a tree inside the walls of Jerusalem. Well, they had to get him out of there before they could proceed with the Passover. It had to be cleansed. The city did. And so having death or dead bodies in Jerusalem during this feast is not a good thing. So that would not have pleased the Jews. So keep that in mind as we look here at what he's saying. So it is elementary to see that Herod in Acts 12 had arrested Peter during the days of unleavened bread. He says after the Passover. The days of unleavened bread would end on the 21st of April, shortly after that would come Herod's celebration of pagan Easter. Herod had not killed Peter during the days of unleavened bread simply because he wanted to wait until Easter. Since it is plain that both the Jews and the Romans would kill during the religious celebration, Herod's opinion seemed that he was not going to let the Jews have all the fun. So his argument is the Jews had all this fun with their celebration of killing the Passover lamb and all this stuff going on. And so I don't want the Jews to have all the fun, so I'm going to wait until my holiday after the days of unleavened bread, and then I'm going to, during my Easter celebration, then I'll kill Peter. So I'll have all the fun. So that's what he's assuming. There's nothing in history to record that. So it's, but notice here what I put here at the end. This doesn't make sense. As he was doing it to please the Jews, a celebration of a pagan feast would not have done that. If Herod is celebrating a pagan feast and killing a Jew during a pagan feast, that's not going to make the Jewish people happy. I mean, that doesn't make sense at all. Not the slightest bit. And so, notice here, next assumption, God providentially led the translators of the King James to choose Easter in Acts 12:4. Now, I would say, yeah, that's probably true. But that's not because it was a pagan holiday and he was trying to clear out some type of confusion if he would put Passover. It's just because that's what the word meant at the time. But this is what Gibb says. Thus we see that it was God's providence which had the Spirit-filled translators of our Bible, King James, to correctly translate Pascha as Easter. Now, what he means by that is not necessarily what we may read. Because Gibb believes in what's called double inspiration. that God miraculously came upon the King James translators, and that God did some special work and guided them in a re-inspiration of the King James and actually correcting the Greek and the Hebrew. And that's just absurd. That didn't happen. The Bible doesn't teach that happens. So it most certainly did not refer to the Jewish Passover. In fact, to change it to Passover would confuse the reader and make the truth of the situation unclear. Actually, it would not, especially since Luke made such a clear statement on it. So this is the main defense for Easter in our King James Bible. That is the main defense that you're going to hear. Probably every one of us in here has heard that argument at some point. Well, Easter is there, and that's referring to a pagan holiday. And that's a holiday that Herod celebrated. That's the argument that's often put forth. And so it is based on the following assumptions. The Jewish Passover had already passed, and the second is that Easter is referring to a pagan celebration that Herod, a pagan king, would have been observing. And both of those assumptions are wrong. So notice here, is Easter exclusively pagan? And the answer to that is no. It is not exclusively pagan. So the prevailing idea that Easter is a pagan holiday can be traced to the book entitled The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop. And notice that year, 1853. When was the King James Bible translated? 1611. When did this event take place that's being recorded? In like 40 AD. 40 or 50 AD. So, I mean, you've got a long period of time there. Somebody should have made this connection before 1853. Now notice here, as an outspoken critic of Roman Catholicism, obviously, I am an outspoken critic of Roman Catholicism myself, and pretty much everybody else. But notice, Hislop falsely made a connection in the relation between Easter and Ishtar based upon the similarity in sound of the words. And this is what he says. What means the term Easter itself? It is not a Christian name. It bears its Chaldean origin on its very forehead. Now, when he says this is funny because prior to 1611, all the English New Testaments read Easter for Passover. So how could you say it's not Christian? Anyway, Easter is nothing else than Astarte, one of the titles of Beltis, the Queen of Heaven, whose name, watch this, as pronounced by the people of Nineveh, was evidently identical with that now in common use in this country. What did Hislop just say? Well, it sounds the same. The name was found by Layard on the Assyrian monument. That name was found by Layard on the Assyrian monument is Ishtar. So Hislop right there, that's where the connection came from, historically. They sound the same. So they must go together. Though these sound alike, they do not have any relation. Notice this. Ishtar means flock or increase. Thus its association with fertility. Easter, on the other hand, has nothing to do with the flocks or animal fertility. Easter in the in German is Oster. And in Luther's German Bible, he translated Passover as Oster. Is a Germanic word derived from the word east. Now that's hard, isn't it? East doesn't mean fertility. That would be like saying we should abandon using the word Thursday because it was associated with Thor. That is where it comes from. Or Sunday was the day of the worship of the sun. So we're not going to call Sunday Sunday or Thursday because of its association. No, that's just the way it is in English. But notice here, the direction of east goes by that name because the Saxon word east means dawn, sunrise, or morning. In Old English, the month of April was called Ostermonode. I think that's how. Anybody else want to give that a shot? Or east or sunrise month. That's all it meant. There was a Saxon spring fertility goddess named Oster, but its name was derived from the name of the month because the days became noticeably longer and things began to grow again. So the celebration of this pagan god, that god got its name from the month that was already called Easter, as opposed to Easter getting its name from the god. This is the other way around. So notice here, because the word Easter is a descriptive word that refers to the dawn or sunrise, it is a fitting term for what it is associated with. Let's look at these. Let's go back to Matthew real quick. Just a couple of these and then we'll be done. Matthew chapter 28. So, we associate Easter with what? The resurrection of Christ. Well, notice this. Matthew 28:1. In the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulchre. Well, what does east mean? Dawn. So you can see the association here. It is a Christian concept here. So let's look at Mark chapter 16, at least the way it's used in the Bible here. So Mark 16, again. Verse 1. Verse 2. And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. Again, same concept. Now, I don't think we need to go to Luke's because it's pretty much the same thing again. The same imagery is not only used to refer to the morning of Christ's resurrection from the dead, it's also used to describe, the second coming to the earth. We're not going to look at all these. We're just going to look at one of these. Let's go back to Malachi for a moment. Malachi is just before Matthew. Malachi chapter 4, verse 2. Says, But unto you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings, and he shall go forth and grow up as calves of the stall. This is a reference to Christ. So he is the Son of Righteousness. Now, he's also referred to as the day star in the New Testament and the morning star in the New Testament. And so this is the idea. He's the Son of Righteousness. He's going to bring light to the world at his coming. But now, notice here, Easter, with its connection to sunrise, pays tribute to the biblical imagery of Christ as the Son of Righteousness. The Old West Saxon version, this would be the Old English, Old English, from prior to 1000, version of the Gospel of Luke translates the word as Easter Dolly. I think that's how it's pronounced, which is Saxon for east or sunrise. Really, the word Easter comes from the biblical language of the Saxons. So quoting Malachi 4:2, this is what Luke 1:78 reads in our Bible. Through the tender mercy of our God, whereby the day spring, would be the Son of Righteousness, from on high hath visited us. Now notice this. This is the West Saxon translation from 990 A.D. You got it? I'm not even going to try to read that. I tried reading that when I was in my office. I'm like, that's a joke. But no, that's English right there. But notice there in bold is the Easter Dolly. So where does that come from? So Easter is related to east, the direction, and was associated with the rising of the Lord from the dead. That's how they understood that, at least prior to 1853. Any questions on that? Okay. Well, if you do, you can ask me and we can try to address them next week or whatever. Father, thank you for this time you've given to us. Thank you for the Word of God. And Lord, every word is vital. Every word is important. Every word is there for a reason. And we know that the words of the Lord are pure words. And Father, thank you that we have the Word of God to study it, to learn your mind. And I pray that we'd be faithful students of it. Help us now as we prepare for the next hour. Pray that you bless our time together today. In Jesus' name, amen.